You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
Welcome to episode 442 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is my absolute favorite guest, Will Porter. Will's been about on 60 episodes or so of the show in the past, and he is currently a staff writer at RT, so a lot of the breaking news you see there is written up by Will Porter. He also does a lot of really good writing through freelance at antiwar.com, Consortium News, and the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, where you go online to find this show. So, Will, welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
Hey, thanks for having me back on, Kyle. I'm good. How you doing?
Well, I'm really good, especially because I'm really excited to talk about this article that we wrote over at the Libertarian Institute. This is like the fourth or fifth article that we've co-authored together. And as always, I think the stuff we do together is very substantive. We, really get down to the hard facts and, try to really paint the narrative, but using a lot of details in there. And I think this article really does a good job of that. It's titled Maximum Failure, Trump's Convulsive North Korea Strategy Can't Bring Kim to the Table. And obviously from the title there, our thesis is that the maximum pressure campaign has majorly failed in Korea, and it's nowhere near bringing Kim to the table. And we'll talk about some of the, probably points along the line where maybe Kim was at the table and a deal could have been done, but the maximum pressure policy failed. But the first thing I want to talk to you about today, Will, is some breaking news that you covered for RT. And it turns out that the Ukrainian Airlines plane that went down in Iran was shot down by an IRGC. That's the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. One of their missile defense systems hit the plane and brought it down. So why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of a picture of what happened here?
Sure. So, this was the morning, I believe, in Iran of January 8th. And, this incident occurred just hours, like not too long after Iran had launched, retaliatory missile strikes on, U.S. positions in Iraq. And this was in retaliation for, you've covered it on the show, the assassination of the Quds Force commander, Qasem Soleimani. And so Iran was finally, retaliating to that, shooting missiles. And hours after that, this Ukrainian International Airlines flight went down under sort of mysterious circumstances at first. It wasn't really clear what had brought this plane down. There was videos that had emerged online showing, at first there was one video that had just shown the plane sort of crashing. You could see it in the distance, like hitting the ground, and it was not clear. It appeared the plane was on fire when it had crashed, but it wasn't clear what had brought this thing down. So Iranian officials came out pretty early and said they believed it was, had to do with equipment malfunction, engine fire that had brought this plane down. And for the next couple of days, Iranian aviation officials and other officials sort of maintained that, this is probably an equipment malfunction. And even as there was sort of chatter pretty early on, there was some idea of was this thing shot down? There was a question as to whether it was shot down, especially because it had just followed this missile strike. And so that kind of raised some people's suspicion of was this thing shot down? And Iran for days sort of denied this. They suggested it's not even possible for this to happen. It's scientifically impossible. However, finally, just a couple nights ago, I think it was Friday, the Iranian officials came out at the highest level and admitted that, yes, it was us who, shot this thing down. They claimed it was on accident. And I tend to believe that it was an accident. I don't think they stood to gain much by shooting down a civilian aircraft. But yeah, so you had the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani coming out and saying, our greatest condolences. This was a huge accident, huge mistake. And also you had the Foreign Minister Javad Zarif coming out and saying much the same. And so now it seems there's little question that Iran's missile defenses did shoot down this airliner.
Right. Well, I've even seen statements from members of the IRGC saying that this was a mistake and that would be the branch of the Iranian government that I guess is responsible for this. So yeah, one of the things you kind of got into there is that this was a mistake. On the last episode I posted on Facebook, I had somebody comment and say, well, the Iranians did spill blood, in that they shot down this plane. But my, point I was making on the last show, Will, was of course that I didn't feel like the retaliation missile strike against the Iraqi bases, spilled any blood. And so I'm just wondering, do you see these as two different events? Is there any chance that this was a part of the Iranian retaliation for killing Soleimani? Or is this, an accident that is, of the consequence of the U.S. and Iranian governments, increase in hostilities in the region?
Yeah, I would definitely not say that this was part of Iran's, measured response to Soleimani's assassination. And I forgot to mention too, I believe there was 176 people aboard this flight. And one of the reasons I would suggest it doesn't make much sense for this to have been part of their retaliation is because well over half of those passengers were Iranian. And so they'd be killing their own citizens. And the bulk of the other citizens on board were Canadians and Ukrainians. And I think there was an Afghan and a German and a Brit. But I don't think there were any Americans on this flight. So it doesn't seem like if this were somehow retaliation for the American assassination of Qasem Soleimani, you would think they would have gone after Americans, if anything. And no, I believe this is genuinely an accident, that this, as you said, it happened in the context of this brinksmanship, of this tit for tat sort of escalation that was happening. But I think it's just, an unfortunate side effect of that. I don't think it's a deliberate part of their response.
Right. That's one thing I think a lot of people are going to try to throw around is, who's responsible, and then whoever you say is responsible, or whenever you answer that question, I think they're going to kind of try to jump on and label it. It seems to me that, both sides are definitely responsible here. As far as, the hostilities between the U.S. and Iran go right now, it seems like the original sin there is Trump withdrawing from the JCPOA. I know there's differences between the U.S. foreign policy and, the Iranian policy at the time in Yemen and Syria, but neither of those things were very serious to the Americans. The excuse for going to war with Iran is if Iran is making a nuclear weapon. And so the JCPOA had really taken direct conflict with Iran off the table. Now that Trump withdrew from that, it seemed like this, brinksmanship and then, another maximum pressure campaign. And well, I think we could have just as easily wrote an article about all the, different sanctions and steps that Trump has taken against, the Ayatollah and the Iranian people, just with Kim in North Korea, and entitled it maximum failure as well, because this policy has just blown up in his face so big. But at the same time, it's not like the Iranians have, just tried to be the most reasonable party here, and they have fought back in this economic war that America is waging against them. And, still debatable, but you had the attacks on the Saudi oil installations, various attacks on different tankers out in the Persian Gulf that have either been blamed on Iran, or at least I think, with a little bit of a wink, maybe Iran suggesting they were behind it, even if it's, not direct and they keep the deniability. It seems like they're more than happy to, be thought of generally as the country that carried out those attacks. So, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, just as far as you see responsibility here. And then, of course, the IRGC, that organization, and whoever decided to shoot down that plane, somebody made the decision to hit the button. That seems, like all those people definitely bear some responsibility here.
Yeah, certainly. I think if, as you're suggesting, if you looked at sort of the timeline over the last year and all these, events, these, things culminating, I don't know, I guess it was just a matter of time before something like this happened, before there was either a deliberate provocation or an accidental shoot down or something, given all these tanker incidents, these things at Saudi oil fields, the sanctions, this, rapidly escalating tensions. I guess it was just a matter of time before something like this did happen. And it's unfortunate it had to be, a bunch of civilians.
Right. Well, and we've seen it before with Iran Air 755 that was shot down by a U.S. ship. What was that, an 89, Will? I think George Bush was still the vice president at the time, so maybe 88. Anyways, the point of that being is that when you have these very hostile situations, in, air defenses and radars not being what people maybe always think of from the movies, these things are pretty imprecise and have a lot of flaws and stuff like that. Mistakes like this can happen, and it should be, kind of one that the calculated, we should factor this in when we're talking about going to war, is that civilians will die and in horrific accidents like this. So I guess with that, let's go ahead and move on to our article on North Korea. Unfortunately, Will, we released this article and, Iran is shooting missiles at, bases that house our U.S. soldiers, in Iraq, and that's kind of stealing the headlines. But at the same time, with all the noise going on, you had the embassy, protests right at the end of the year, and then the killing of Soleimani. There hasn't been a whole lot of attention paid to the fact that Kim's Christmas present came up empty, and the deadline came and passed, and there hasn't been a major weapons test by the North Koreans. So, maybe let's go back to 2016 here and just talk and remember, what was candidate Trump saying about Kim Jong-un and getting along with North Korea?
Sure. So, yeah, as you refer to, candidate Donald Trump is much different from Donald Trump today in terms of like how he talks about North Korea. So at the time, Trump was, referring fairly regularly, talking about like the possibility that he might want to set up meetings with North Korea, the North Korean government, or with Kim himself. In fact, he suggested that Kim might even come to the United States for a meeting, which is something that's never happened, of course. North Korean leaders never been invited for a formal talks to the United States. He even talked about, in his sort of transactional Trumpian way, but still talked about, the possibility of drawing down some of the 30,000 American soldiers stationed in South Korea. And these things are kind of like unheard of. Like this is not something that you would usually hear a Republican nominee saying. He was, even entertaining. And you can even see, like, we cite the Times in our report, the New York Times, saying like, how sort of shocked they were that how this would overturn decades of American policy if Trump went through with some of these things. And so I don't think we're exaggerating that Trump was, really insinuating some unique stuff here as a Republican nominee, or even as a Republican candidate, even before the nomination. And so, yeah, it did seem like we were poised for some kind of difference, some kind of change. Like Trump was sort of a wild card here. It seemed like he had some, and he had like the right wing credentials too. Like he's the right wing kind of businessman, tough guy. Like he had this mandate, it seemed, to go in and do this sort of Nixon goes to China kind of thing, or he at least had that leeway. But very soon into his administration, unfortunately, that sort of all got stopped. Like, I think there were a lot of people in Washington who were kind of panicked by his like pretense, his flirting with détente, his flirting with the idea of like any kind of détente. And unfortunately, I think he ended up, hiring people in his own administration who sort of like helped to reverse him on the North Korea question. However, these informal talks that had been planned with North Korean officials early on in the Trump administration were canceled pretty quickly. And the catalyzing thing here is something that like started to shift relations in the other way, or shift Trump's momentum in the other way, was the assassination of Kim Jong-un's half brother, Kim Jong-nam. I think he was in like a Malaysian airport or something, and he was killed with VX nerve agent. And I'm not totally sure how well proven it is that North Korea did this. I guess I don't really doubt it. But nonetheless, this guy's assassination, Kim Jong-un's half brother, this sort of led to the U.S. called off these early talks under the Trump administration, and it sort of started reversing the momentum. James Mattis was soon after sent to Seoul to reassure the South Koreans that there would be no drawdown of troops in the South, and sort of this, the Trump that we saw take off is sort of kind of unraveled on North Korea, at least.
Right. Well, this is in the very early episodes, the single digit episodes of Foreign Policy Focus. This is unfolding. And I remember at the time talking about Nikki Haley, who is then U.S. ambassador to the UN, really exploiting this and calling off, because there were some plans for some informal talks with the North Koreans. That would have been the kind of thing that maybe could have really had Trump thinking that there's a possibility here. And then they took those talks away. Not, rather than go, because they were informal talks anyway, why not go talk to the North Koreans then and try to see what's going on, why this guy was killed and all that? I think it seemed to me that this was the event that they needed to convince Trump that this is a policy that he had to take on North Korea. And of course, this was a problem with Trump from the beginning, and why, me and you weren't, jumping on board the Trump train, even though he was talking about, possibly bringing troops home from South Korea, which sounds awesome. But there didn't seem to be any principle or philosophy behind it. And so, Will, why don't we talk a little bit about Fire and Fury now? Because it seems almost unbelievable that, Mr. Art of the Deal on the campaign trail, talking about getting a deal done like never before with the North Koreans, is suddenly threatening to nuke the country.
Yeah. So I think you're referring to the Fire and Fury comment came in this press conference where he threatened North Korea with, I forget what the exact line was, but like something like fire and fury like they've never seen before, like referring to, I guess you could say it's just like a massive bombing campaign, but it sounded like he was referring to nuclear weapons, nuclear annihilation and stuff. And so, yeah, this really kicked off like an intense period of hostilities between our two countries, where the U.S. and North Korea are trading threats. North Korea carried out a few missile tests, I think, in sort of like retaliation to these, in this sort of context of hostility. And this completely, derailed any chances, it seemed, to have good relations with North Korea right off the get-go. Like, if we were going to have any kind of talks now we're going to have to overcome this huge bout of hostility, instead of Trump taking office right away and sort of using momentum and a mandate to make things happen with North Korea. Now it totally introduced this element of hostility. And from here on, this is where the Trump administration embarked on its maximum pressure campaign. This is really where they decided that, they were going to do this. And that was sort of the policy that codified and that took shape. And that sort of all came from this Fire and Fury period where, early on in Trump's administration, hostilities went to like a, unprecedented level.
Right. Well, yeah. So this is really interesting. You point out that it starts this, U.S. policy of economic warfare. Well, which was already ongoing. It's not like we had a JCPOA with North Korea during the Obama administration, and the relationships between the countries were improving or anything. The U.S. had sanctions on North Korea, and they were fairly isolated on the world stage, but even more so, once the Trump administration took charge, and he worked, and put leverage on the Chinese even to try to cut down on smuggling going into North Korea. And I remember when the ghost ships started showing up, ships of empty people because they all starved to death, and they eventually wash up on some South Korean or Japanese or Russian island. There were Trump administration officials saying this was the sanctions starting to bite. And so they were admitting that, the purpose of the sanctions was to starve people to death. And so, that's now the U.S. war, economic war that's going on. But things start to change. And at least for me in my lifetime, Will, this is probably the most important moment of any Olympic Games ever, when we have the Koreans walk into the games under a united Korean flag. So maybe let's go into now the diplomacy that was kicked off by the 2018 games.
Sure. So yeah, right around the time that this intense hostility is going on, all the fire and fury is happening between the U.S. and North Korea. A new president is elected in South Korea, and this guy Moon Jae-in is sort of like a real believer in Korean peace and a long-term advocate for this. Like, he's not a super hawk who's, there've been some very hawkish presidents in the seat there in South Korea before, and this guy was sort of different. And so things were kind of aligning in a weird way, where as hostilities are sort of flaring up between the U.S. and North Korea, this, sort of peacenik gets elected in South Korea. And this is why we call the policy convulsive, because there's sort of all these like conflicting forces at play here. And Moon Jae-in, I think, has helped a lot throughout this whole process to sort of rein in the U.S. and sort of, to be a counterbalance to the more hawkish voices in Trump's ear. And so despite the sort of all the fire and fury and stuff going on, President Moon did lead this effort to see the two Koreas compete under the same flag at the 2018 Winter Olympics. And this really created a lot of momentum for, further like real diplomacy. And so, even though it's just a sporting event, like these things really do matter, like cultural connection and cultural ties, especially with the Koreas, because they're sort of the same society, but like divided in half. And so seeing them engage in these cultural exchanges is really important. And in fact, the momentum from the Olympic Games would help to establish the first U.S. North Korean summit, which was held in Singapore in the summer of 2018. And this summit, I mean, it's interesting. Like we're saying, there's a lot of convulsions going on here because hostilities rose to their absolute peak under the Fire and Fury thing. But now the diplomacy seems to rise to its absolute peak. So the meeting results in a joint statement between North Korea and the United States, which agrees to continue dialogue, continue the process of trying to de-escalate things and trying to inch forward toward rapprochement. And the North Koreans even I think they sort of make a preliminary commitment that they will discuss the idea of denuclearization and disarmament, which is something that's a major part of the U.S. Demand. Like the U.S. wants North Korea to dismantle its nuclear arsenal. And North Korea signaled some willingness that they would talk about this, but only in exchange for trust building measures and sanctions relief. So those are the main two positions here is the U.S. wants to see North Korea disarm, and North Korea wants, to be guaranteed they're not going to be invaded by the U.S. and that they want sanctions relief on their economy. So that's the major two positions here. That's what, I don't know, if you had to oversimplify what the sides want, that's it. And it seemed that the Singapore summit started to address these major issues. And it didn't result in, it didn't lead to full détente. We didn't have a peace deal out of it or something. But nonetheless, it did result in some real, momentum, some real achievements, I would say. The North Koreans returned remains of Americans that were killed during the Korean War, which has also been a major outstanding thing for a long time, that the U.S. has, called on them to, find or return remains of Americans killed during that war. And around the same time here, this framework for real long-term dealings between the U.S. and North Korea emerged, and that's called freeze for freeze. And under freeze for freeze, this is sort of the thing where you would see, the two sides trade small concessions. So the U.S. would agree to not, carry out these hostile war games with the South, because the U.S. and South Korea carry out these annual war games where they basically practice for an invasion of North Korea. And in exchange for that, the North said that they would, halt their missile tests and nuclear tests. And so this, seemed to be this is a major achievement around the time of the Singapore summit, was this freeze for freeze status. And of course, in the meanwhile, President Moon was also allowed a freer hand to sort of further improve relations, because there's all kinds of different initiatives going on. I think there's a railway. I forget if the railway was mentioned at Singapore or if that was later, but there were, multiple smaller initiatives too going on between the North and the South that, they were freer to pursue at this time.
Right. Yeah. So that's one of the things about the U.S. sanctions and the, economic war the U.S. was waging on North Korea, and that we should mention will continue through the freeze for freeze period. So there were times where Moon Jae-in was able to get some, braids and kind of, we'll look the other way on these sanction situations. But there's other times where it was a real barrier to getting kind of these deals, like building a railway from South Korea to North Korea. They're talking about, the fuel that's used on the North Korean side can't come from South Korea, and all these other things that were essentially holding it up and, kind of dragging this along. But I think we're, right in the article here to identify that this was the time it seemed like the most progress was going on. Moon Jae-in, when he came into office in, I think it was October of 2017, he was an opposition candidate to the previous administration, and the president had been removed from office and jailed for corruption. And so, kind of imagine the political capital a U.S. president would have. So Moon Jae-in seemed to have the ability to kind of pursue this. Polling in South Korea, was very supportive of Moon Jae-in in these efforts. And at the time, there were even protests against the U.S. deploying THAAD missile systems to South Korea because they didn't want to become targets by having those U.S. missile defense systems around their area. But, so I think that the possibility for peace here was high. But, Moon Jae-in still had to compete and contest with the Americans to try to get around the U.S. sanctions. I also just want to highlight here that Kim came to the table with Trump at Singapore because of the, positive momentum built by, the Olympic Games and the two sides starting to talk and implementing this freeze for freeze and walking back different war games and stuff like that. That's what, the diplomacy that created that worked. It wasn't because of the sanctions on North Korea. So, we had the Singapore summit. They put out this statement that both sides signed. It has 4 points. On the top of it, they talk about ending the hostile policies between the two nations. And then, starting some joint diplomatic efforts, establishing more relationships, withdrawing the hostile U.S. policy. And then at the end, getting to denuclearization. Now, right at the summit, as you mentioned, Kim took some steps like dismantling part of an engine facility. Another really cool thing that happened because of the Singapore summit was there were some family visits that were able to happen. So that the line between North and South Korea, I think, was pretty arbitrarily drawn by Americans. And because of that, there's families that are on the wrong side of the line. And so, this is 70 years later. So this is, old people, old siblings who haven't seen each other in decades, finally get a chance to, kind of ask how life's been and stuff like that. Really sad, but also really great that those events got to happen. But then enter John Bolton and tell us what him and his Libya model do to the progress going on here.
Right. So on one side of this, you have, President Moon Jae-in, who's, really seems to be like a louder voice for peace, pushing for peace. On the other side of the coin here, you have John Bolton, who was hired as Trump's national security advisor in April 2018. And this is actually prior to the Singapore summit, but Bolton's influence wouldn't really be felt there as much for whatever combination of reasons. He didn't have so much sway at Singapore. But nonetheless, still, your audience is probably familiar with John Bolton as a super hawk and as a major supporter of the Iraq War. But for North Korea specifically, he had sort of like a real significance there. He played a key role in destroying the agreed framework under the Bush administration. The agreed framework was a Clinton era nuclear deal that, as one of its major things, would have seen the North Koreans, I think, dismantle like their main nuclear reactor. I think that was like the major concession that they had agreed to there. But under Bush, of course, Bolton helped to antagonize North Korea until they were basically forced out of the NPT, until they like abandoned it. With the accusations of illicit uranium work, I think was the major thing that he was pushing. And this just majorly helped to, pushing them out of wrecking the agreed framework and then eventually pushing them out of the NPT. That would majorly propel conflict between our two countries. And this is especially at the time, too, when the U.S. is embarking on the war on terror. I mean, remember, Bolton was partially responsible for putting North Korea on the axis of evil. And so with Iraq, a country that we would later overthrow. And so, I don't know, this Bolton is like a major hawk on North Korea and has a real reputation in their eyes with with the North Korean regime, as being just like an intransigent, mad bomber, somebody you really can't deal with. And so this is the guy who Trump hired to, basically lead his national security team in some ways.
Just to throw in one more there, Will, is, just before he became a national security advisor, he wrote an op-ed, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, saying that the U.S. could launch a preemptive strike on North Korea. So
exactly
the North Koreans had history, and they had a relevant recent article from John Bolton to be like, this guy obviously doesn't want peace. He's a hawk. He wants to see the fall of the Kim regime. And so one of to me the great moment of the Singapore summit was seeing how unhappy John Bolton was there. I mean, if you guys want to Google John Bolton Singapore, you could see the frown underneath that mustache. It's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, but get into the Libyan model a little bit here.
Yeah. So just a few weeks before the Singapore summit, Bolton didn't, he didn't have much sway at Singapore, but that was not for want of trying. He certainly was trying to, insinuate himself into the North Korea policy. And just a few weeks before Singapore, he was invoking what he was calling the Libya model for disarmament in North Korea. And of course, he's referring to the fact that the Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi, did give up his he had a primitive nuclear weapons program that he gave up. But surely the North Koreans, when they hear Libya model, I'm sure they think of, Muammar Gaddafi crawling out of a sewer drain, right before he was executed by U.S.-backed rebels in a regime change operation. Surely that's the image that the Libya model would invoke for the North Koreans. And so, this is the guy who's leading Trump's national security team, invoking the Libya model, while the U.S. is trying to pursue talks and negotiations with North Korea, which is like extremely hawkish and threatening. That's like a mortal threat to them, basically. Like you're threatening them with, mind you, this is the same guy who has put them on the axis of evil, the same guy who was just a couple months prior making a legal case for a first strike on North Korea. Now he's, invoking the Libya model for this country. And so that really would, would screw up the sort of the efforts in the direction of Moon of, trying to negotiate a long-term peace deal, where meanwhile you have Bolton standing there trying to hurl bombs like this, hurl poison pills into the dealings by, making these intense demands. At some point, one of Bolton's major demands was that he wanted the North to disarm and dismantle its nuclear program within the space of a year, which is like a crazy idea. That's like a maximum concession, just demanding like basically full out surrender from their side before we give them a single concession. Or, maybe we'll, scale back our war games by 1%, but you have to surrender 100%. That's sort of like the Bolton model of negotiations. Just demand all out surrender, demand full, demand every single condition be met, and you don't have to offer a single concession. That's the guy who's sort of, helping to lead some of the diplomacy with foreign countries now, including North Korea, or was at the time, I should say.
Yeah, so, one of the other crazy things about that, Will, is at that same time you had the Trump administration withdrawing from the nuclear deal with Iran. And basically, the Iranians weren't building a nuclear weapon. So when they were negotiating with the Americans, they really weren't giving up a whole lot. I mean, they were putting caps on their enrichment program, and I'm sure that, did have some meaningful impacts, like to the Iranian nuclear, civilian nuclear capabilities and all the inspections and whatnot. But really, the goal there was to take war with the U.S. off the table. However, they did, like I said, put meaningful limitations and destroy parts of their nuclear facilities up front. And that's what John Bolton was asking Kim to do. But then the U.S. was snapping bad sanctions on Iran already when everybody agreed they were still within the agreement. So, I mean, it seemed to me absolutely insane that you could like have these two policies at the same time, that you could be telling the North Koreans who, when you looked at the national security strategy put forward by the Trump administration, in there, they're kind of labeled alongside Iran as the rogue regimes. So, they say they're generally going to treat these two regimes like they're the same problem. And then you bail out of one deal with one, and then you try to put the other one in the same deal. I mean, it seemed like that on the face of it was enough to convince the North Koreans that this would never work, and that the Libya model by John Bolton was really just a poison pill. It wasn't anything that I don't believe that John Bolton thought the North Koreans would ever agree to it, and that the point of him offering that was to make sure that no détente was reached.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that is a good point too, to point out that meanwhile we're over here destroying an arms control agreement with Iran as we're trying to supposedly ink one with the North Koreans. And Bolton himself is of course has been a major enemy of the JCPOA with Iran. And really every other arms control agreement, it seems too, like the ABM treaty with Russia, this guy has never met arms control treaty that he didn't think was too restrictive of the United States, that he didn't want to destroy. And so, yeah, it's interesting.
So, we do have a period, Will, between Singapore and Hanoi, was this 6 or 7 months, where it seems like generally the position coming out of the Trump administration, although there's little blips and signs along the way that may not be the case, is that they are looking at the Libyan model. However, a couple weeks before we get to Hanoi, actually, there's a speech, I believe, by Stephen Biegun, who is now the State Department #2, but at the time was just heading the talks with North Korea, suggesting that the U.S. was looking at some kind of step-by-step policy with the North Koreans. But that isn't what ends up happening at Hanoi. So what happened at Hanoi and why?
Yeah, so like you said, this Began guy had this seemingly a different approach to the, more Bolton-esque Libya model approach. It seemed like Began was talking about, the right way forward, sort of the freeze for freeze idea, where you're going to slowly trade concessions with each other and sort of, cautiously see the North dismantle its nuclear arsenal as the U.S. slowly reduces sanctions and stuff. But that would not endure. That approach would not endure, because actually what happened at Hanoi, which is a meeting, the next U.S. North Korean summit held in February 2019 in Vietnam, Bolton totally upstaged Began. And the deal that Trump would end up presenting to Kim was not at all like akin to what Began was suggesting. It was more of a sort of the maximum, we demand maximum concessions and we put maximum pressure in exchange for nothing. Like, we give very little. And so, of course, this deal was not something Kim could accept. Like, the step-by-step procedure that we had signaled that we were going through, that we were going to pursue, we sort of just like threw it aside, tossed it in the trash, and, picked right back up with this maximum hostility kind of approach. And it basically killed the momentum. It killed any like progress that we had made at Singapore. We didn't build on it at Hanoi because we didn't pursue this more like moderate, approach that gave concessions. We just picked back up the poison pill approach.
So Hanoi, and ends up going pretty poorly. Kim leaves after a couple hours, and it seems like Todd's really cool at this point. But the freeze for freeze is still going on. So, generally we had this really interesting thing where, we, at the beginning of the Fire and Fury period, we have all this hostile rhetoric and we put in this economic war in place. And that's, hold through the same time, no matter how the rhetoric has changed. The freeze for freeze agreement went in place, and, the Americans kind of followed it. Like, there was like a spirit of like, we really reduced the war games, and they didn't do like the big massive aerial war games that involve like hundreds of planes and tens of thousands of soldiers. But at the same time, they've carried out war games throughout this freeze for freeze period. And so that's kind of gone on no matter how the rhetoric's changed. So even after, we left Hanoi, this is, February 2019, up until this point, North Korea still hasn't conducted a weapons test, that is part of their, I guess, nuclear program. There's a couple engine tests that I guess are questionable whether they were part for it. But the Trump administration has signaled that they don't feel the North Koreans are breaking the freeze for freeze agreement. And I think that's kind of true. And the Americans have kind of continued their same amount of war games throughout. But then in April of 2019, we have Kim Jong-un setting an end of year deadline, basically saying that the peace movement has to be going in the right place by then, or that he was done with it. And for the next 2 months, not a whole lot happens, Will. And I don't know if it's distraction with other stuff or, why, but generally up until we have this, kind of Trump tweet saying that, hey, Kim, I'm going to be in the area. If you want me at the DMZ, I'm open to it. And that meeting actually happening, there's not a whole lot of, stuff going on changing how the U.S. and North Korean policy is, other than we're still waging the maximum pressure campaign. And there's kind of this freeze for freeze agreement in place. But, Will, why don't you talk a little bit about the DMZ meeting, President Moon's role in setting it up, and then, the interesting list of attendees.
Sure. So, not long after Kim had issued this year-end deadline where he said, let's take a new attitude here and let's revamp these talks. Moon had traveled to Washington for meetings with his counterpart, with Trump. And shortly after this, I guess Moon did convince Trump to invite Kim to the DMZ. And this is like a pretty big deal, a pretty historic meeting. Trump at this meeting became the first U.S. president to cross into like North Korean territory proper, cross over the DMZ for like I don't know if you'd call it an official meeting. It was kind of like this weird impromptu stop by. But nonetheless, another huge significant thing of this meeting was who was there and who wasn't there. And so sort of like at Singapore, like where Bolton was sidelined, Bolton was not even there at the DMZ meeting. he had been shipped off to Mongolia for meetings with their like state secretary or something, some fairly like low level meetings. While meanwhile, Trump did this historic sort of like move toward peace. The meeting was certainly not this hostile thing. It was a good thing. There was, handshakes and people were smiling and laughing. It was like a good meeting. And who was there instead was Fox News commentator and host Tucker Carlson, who is it's kind of symbolic because Carlson has been, at least as of late, has been like a real opponent of someone like Bolton, and has even had him on his show and kind of like trashed him right there on the show. And so the fact that Tucker Carlson was there at this meeting and not John Bolton, like that was sort of a good sign. It seemed like, wow, things are going in this different direction. They're going in the, opposite from the Bolton direction, more in the moon direction. But sort of that was sort of the character that's this whole policy is characterized by this sort of back and forth, like, things are constantly vacillating between these two poles, but here was sort of like one of the peaks of, toward the moon direction, toward the peace end of the spectrum here, was this DMZ meeting. And out of this DMZ meeting, actually, I think there was like sort of tentative agreements to continue talks and to continue meeting. And that these talks would be led again by Stephen Biegun, not by Bolton or not by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. And so it seemed like that, this DMZ meeting had produced some progress here again. Like it seemed like maybe we were back on track for, the Biegun approach of, the freeze for freeze approach. And also right around the same time, it seemed that Bolton's his influence in the White House was waning in general. And that like maybe he soon would get, kicked out, would get fired. And that would eventually happen. Bolton would be kicked out. It's seemingly over his differences with the president over, these kind of issues. But nonetheless, though, that really wouldn't last, though, because even though Biegun was put, back in charge of the negotiating teams, there were joint war games between the U.S. and South Korea set for a little later in the summer, for August of 2019. And this would end up being a major roadblock between, for the momentum that was generated at the DMZ meeting.
Right. And these war games are important because, the U.S. puts out, they're defensive. That's what we heard through this whole freeze for freeze thing. Oh, they're defensive war games. They're defensive war games. Well, Will, tell me, does this sound like a defensive war game? We're going to simulate 90 days after the defeat of the North Korean government. The Kim regime has fallen, and we're trying to occupy the country.
It's just defensive, completely, of course.
Right. That's, somehow Soleimani was killed in self-defense, right? It is that level of absurdity. So, these war games plus war games scheduled for later in the year, by October, it seemed fairly clear that nothing was going to happen. I think there's one more meeting where the U.S. sent some representatives, was it to Sweden or Switzerland, and met with the North Koreans, and the U.S. offered the same old, and the North Koreans said, well, if you got something new, call us, but, see you later, pal. And, that's kind of where we left off. Starting in December, North Korea started threatening Christmas surprise and, saying that, hey, there's this end of the year deadline. You should really watch out for it. So, Will, what does Santa Kim Jong-un give us for Christmas?
Yeah, he ended up bringing nothing. Like there was a huge there was a spike in reports in the mainstream media about how, North Korea was going to, there was widespread predictions they were going to do a big a weapons test that was going to be Kim's Christmas gift. And some people, I think, were even suggesting even more ominously that it was going to be an attack or something, like in the more extreme suggestions. But yeah, Christmas kind of came and rolled by with nothing. Like Kim never did. There was no big weapons test. There wasn't even a big hostile blustery announcement, as the North Koreans sometimes like to do. Their statements can be kind of wild. But instead, we got this more sort of sober, calm response from the North. And they just put out this statement basically resigning themselves to reality, resigning themselves to the fact that things were not progressing. And the statement is kind of oddly worded out of the North Korean state media. But the statement that Kim put out, part of it said, "The present situation, warning of long confrontation with the U.S., urgently requires us to make it a fait accompli that we have to live under the sanctions by the hostile forces in the future." And that was Kim himself saying that. And so basically he was just saying that we accept that there are going to be sanctions for the duration and that like we're no longer going to be, actively pursuing peace or any kind of détente or rapprochement with the United States. And they kind of, because for a minute Kim seemed to be sort of relying on that idea that this would happen. Like he was sort of like, I don't know, he was investing into that sort of direction. But now here he's saying he's reversing that direction. He will no longer really put a lot of effort into this. And while I think the North still had held out that the freeze for freeze status could maybe be pursued, they were no longer going to seek some kind of grand bargain or deal with the United States. They'd finally kind of given up in the face of all this convulsive back and forth. We have some progress at a meeting, and then John Bolton takes over, and there's maximum pressure. And then we have progress in a meeting, and et cetera, et cetera. And they just finally decided they're not doing this anymore. They're getting off this train. And sort of at the end of this, like we really, we did achieve some, freeze for freeze stuff. That is a good, that's good momentum that we could maybe build on in the future. But ultimately, we really accomplished nothing. This maximum pressure campaign has left us really like no better than where Trump started when he first took office. His predecessor, like the Obama administration, didn't really do that much on the North Korea front. There wasn't a ton of, movement in that area under his predecessor. And so sort of we're back to no better than where Trump started. And if anything, it's worse because now we've squandered, that much more diplomatic capital, that much more credibility that we're some kind of faithful negotiation partner. Like, now we're in that position where the North is probably more convinced than ever of its need for some kind of nuclear deterrent because now it's, ever more convinced that it can't deal with the United States as like a reasonable partner, a reasonable, negotiator. And so, yeah, we've really, we come full circle and we've really accomplished nothing with this maximum pressure campaign.
Yeah, well, but there have been real effects on the North Koreans during this time, and certainly there's North Koreans dying because the Kim regime are brutal, dictators and totalitarians, and they have a really terrible kind of government over there. But at the same time, the squeeze from the U.S. sanctions, I'm sure, is just racking up. And the U.S. officials, like I said, admit this because when North Koreans starve to death, they say the sanctions are biting. So, and obviously these are people that, can't stand up against, the Kim regime. And just another thing, a parallel I want to point out to the Iran situation that I'm sure the Kim regime has seen is that when the U.S. takes sanctions away and then your economy starts to adjust to a more open world, and then if you slap sanctions back on, it really does a lot of damage to economies. And this is something that Russia has certainly had to contend with, post Crimean, the coup in that country, and then Crimea leaving and joining Russia. All of that, does a lot of damage. All those sanctions do a lot of damage to economies. And so, Kim, I think says like, this is the hand I'm dealt and this is the way I'm going to play it. And, as you were saying, Will, and as our article concludes, we've just squandered a really huge opportunity. I mean, how often are you going to have it that the president of South Korea is coming in on all this, political momentum and has just massive support of the people and I guess of the whole kind of government there and was able to really look to take steps in the right direction. I mean, there's a real right wing in South Korea that, the more powerful they are, the more they'll push back. And, certainly Kim isn't, Moon isn't a perfect peacenik. He, has imported a lot of American weapons like F-35s throughout this time that the, Kim regime identifies as a real problem. I don't think the radars are probably capable of picking up the F-35s. And so, these are a particular threat to them. And then there's also the fact that the South Koreans, released this creepy video of, their planes going and bombing a whole bunch of North Korean targets and how they're going to carry out like these decapitation strikes and stuff like that. And so, there's a real right wing there. And whenever the South Korean government isn't willing to push, it seems like then, nothing will have a chance of getting done. So it's really unfortunate how this has all ended up playing out, Will.
Yeah, it really is. And just to add to what you were saying to the sanctions real quick, I meant to cite this number earlier, but this group Korea Peace Now had found that in 2018, I believe it was just in this year alone, that the sanctions had caused something like 3,900 deaths, and 3,100 of those were children under the age of 5. So like that's when they say the sanctions are biting. That's what they're talking about.
Well, I guess, do you have any kind of idea of where this could go in 2020? I guess the maybe to try to not leave it on a super optimistic note, because I don't think there's a whole lot of reason for optimism, but North Korea didn't test the long range an ICBM. They didn't do a nuclear test. And so, with Donald Trump, maybe, get super desperate for some kind of win at some point and sign some kind of deal. I mean, the opposition for the Democrats to it is going to be so stupid and so cruel, but maybe, just kind of Trump swinging back and forth and things kind of line up just right and he has the right momentum and a deal ends up getting done. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with Trump is that even when he took office, like the entire time he's been this sort of wild card. It's hard to tell what this dude's going to do. Like he doesn't seem to be really moored to anything. So like, yeah, I guess it's possible that he gets desperate enough, like under the whole impeachment drama and all this stuff, that maybe he does, decide that he needs some kind of accomplishment to sell to people. And that, this would be, I don't know if it'd be easy to accomplish, but certainly it's not, I don't know. I feel like with Moon in place, like, there's a lot of things that would make this an easier thing to accomplish. It'd be an easy deal to make. And, yeah, I mean, I don't know how likely that is, but certainly it's a possibility.
It does seem unfortunate, like that we seem pretty much resigned to know that Donald Trump isn't going to have like this moment of compassion and just ease sanctions on North Korea a little bit and take them back to where they were at the start of his presidency before the maximum pressure campaign. And isn't that, I guess, probably one of the reasons that me and you are both libertarians, right? Is anytime a government program starts, you can't get the damn thing to stop. And this maximum pressure campaign just seems to be another example of that, where now if you advocate for, withdrawing or even taking sanctions back to where they were at the end of the Obama administration, just like if you try to take the funding for Ukraine back to where it was at the end of the Obama administration, that we're not giving lethal military aid to the Kiev government, or, we don't have these extreme sanctions on North Korea, then, you're a puppet of Kim or Putin.
Right. It's the sort of like the ratchet effect, like every new escalation just becomes like the new baseline. Now like no, we couldn't possibly de-escalate from there. This is just like the bare minimum now. If anything, we have to go forward. So it's always that ratcheting forward. So I think that's sort of what you're referring to.
All right. Well, do you have anything else to add here?
No, I think we covered most of the points in our article. Of course, it's like there's a lot more to say about the subject in general, but hopefully, your listeners can go read our piece, and we got lots and lots of links in there and stuff that they can go and explore. So, yeah. All
right. Thanks. And everybody go check out Will Porter's Twitter account, WKP ANCAP. He posts, I think, all of his the ones that he puts out from RT up there. Every morning I check that out. He writes at night, so in the morning you get like a nice 4 or 5 Will Porter breakdowns on things. Not all of them are foreign policy. Not all of them are maybe interesting politically. But usually 2 or 3 a night are very good takes on, kind of current events and foreign policy, the kind of newsy thing that you could share. But it's also written by an ANCAP, so there's not a whole bunch of status garbage in it like you get when you go through like the Reuters or the AP feed. So, Will, I really appreciate that service. Do you have anything else to plug?
No. Yeah, my Twitter handle, you can go check that out there. I write for a few different websites. You can find me sometimes at the Libertarian Institute, more often than you'd find me at Anti-War Consortium lately. But yeah, I appreciate the kind words. I appreciate what you do too, Kyle. Your news roundups and stuff are always extremely helpful.
All right. And, I guess to say the audience, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of, podcast episodes with me and Will to hear in 2020. And hopefully a couple more articles too. So thanks so much, Will. And check out the Libertarian Institute.
Thanks, Cal.